Welcome to Basic Brewing Radio for Thursday, May 4th, 2006. I'm James Spencer. Here at Basic Brewing Radio, we're all about home brewing. Well, this week we talk to the creator of Poor Richard's Ale, Tony Simmons of Pagosa Brewing Company in Pagosa Springs, Colorado. Tony's recipe was originally designed to celebrate the 300th anniversary of the birth of Ben Franklin, and it's one of the featured recipes for this coming weekend's Big Brew. We'll talk to Tony about how he researched and formulated Poor Richard's, and we'll talk about his new brewery and the challenges of getting that off the ground. Well, there was a bit of geeky excitement around here this past week. I got an email from Brian of thebrewlounge.com congratulating me on my appearance on Rocket Boom, that ever-so-popular video podcast. Well, I scurried on over to rocketboom.com, and sure enough, there was a clip from Basic Brewing Video on there. Oddly, it's a clip from the only episode where Steve doesn't appear. Amanda Congdon said, "It's a perfect example of a nice, niche vlog. The very well-informed beer buffs, James and Steve, are just teetering on the line between awkward and downright hilarious." Well, you know, that sounds about right. Sometimes we teeter one way or the other, but, that's pretty good characterization. Thanks to Tim Schwartz of the Museum of the Moving Image for apparently pointing the Rocket Boom folks our way, and welcome to those of you who are listening as a result of seeing us on Rocket Boom. I want to say howdy to Arnie, who claims to be the only all-grain brewer in Iceland. Arnie just wrote in to say hi and says, "Please never stop doing these shows." No pressure there, Arnie. Thanks. This is the 43rd episode of Basic Brewing Radio. Knock wood, I haven't missed a week since our first episode on July 14th of last year. Now, I do plan to take a couple of weeks off in late June and early July, but have no fear. We'll be back with lots of good stuff, including stuff from the National Homebrewers Conference in Orlando, which is happening the latter part of June. You can go to beertown.org to check out more information about that. Michael from Denmark writes in to say, "I just listened to your show regarding sanitization. We clean our bottles with a bottle cleaner and put them in the oven at 150 degrees Celsius for about an hour. That's a little over 300 degrees Fahrenheit. We then use foil to protect them against dust. On bottling day, we simply remove the foil and fill them." Well, you know, I've heard and read about using the oven for bottle sanitization, and if you do it right, you can actually sterilize your bottles and not just sanitize them. That means that there are absolutely no viable bugs in there whatsoever. From what I understand, you have to be careful not to shock the bottles with quick temperature changes, or there's a risk that they will break. I've read where it's best to put the bottles in the cold oven and let them warm up as the oven is warming up to temperature. Now, I've never used the oven, although it sounds like a good idea if you want to get the bottles absolutely sterile. I use the dishwasher, as I've said before in this show. I run the bottles in a cycle without soap or rinse agent and use the heated drying feature. Last week, coincidentally, I put a temperature probe in there with the bottles, and during the drying cycle, my dishwasher reached a high temperature of 166 degrees Fahrenheit. That's a little over 74 degrees Celsius. And it was able to hold a temperature over 160 degrees for about 15 minutes. Now, I've read, from what I've read, milk is pasteurized at 161 degrees Fahrenheit. That's almost 72 degrees C. And it only has to be at that temperature for 15 seconds to kill 99.99% of bacteria. I think that's called log 4. That's like a log 4 kill. So, if I can hold above that temperature, above 160, 161, for more than 15 minutes, as opposed to 15 seconds, I think I'm doing pretty well. Now, technically, it's not enough to sterilize the bottles, but personally, I'm willing to accept the trade-off for convenience. And as I've said many times on this show, it's all in what makes you comfortable. If you want to go the oven route and get your bottles sterile, that's great. If you want to sanitize in some sanitizing solution, that's great as well. If you want to use the dishwasher, mine gets hot enough to to pasteurize, apparently. So it's all in what makes you comfortable and what works for you. I think the important thing is to get your bottles clean, and the best thing to do on that is to rinse them out as soon as you pour the beer out of the bottle, because that way all the nutrients are out of there for all the mold and whatever to grow in there. Kevin from Brookfield, Connecticut writes in to say, I just got through watching your video cast on making mead and have been inspired to give it a try. The question I have for you is, can you make a similar type of drink substituting maple syrup, or as we say around here, syrup, for the honey? I work for an organization that produces maple syrup each year and am looking to experiment. Well, Kevin, maple syrup is used as an adjunct to add flavor and fermentability to beers, but I haven't heard of anyone using maple syrup as the primary fermentable in a drink. It would get expensive pretty quick to use the real stuff in any large quantity, I would assume. I suggested to Kevin that he might want to experiment with a small batch, mixing a bit of syrup with water and pitching some yeast in there to see what happens and what he gets. But do you know of a recipe that's based on maple syrup? If so, let me know at james@basicbrewing.com or use the contact form on basicbrewing.com and let me know. Maple syrup beer or mead. I don't know what you would call it. Nick from Sydney wants to know if anyone's got a good extract recipe for a Munich Dunkel. If you know of one of those, let me know as well. Nick says he's added cocoa powder to our espresso porter recipe that he found on basicbrewing.com to make a mocha version, mocha espresso porter. That sounds very tasty. David from the UK says that I might not want to use the phrase dog's watsits in polite company. Well, thanks, David. Just goes to show that I can put my foot in my mouth on multiple continents. I'm an international foot in the mouth guy. So thanks, David, for that warning. Apparently, dogs' watsits are basically what you would think, which is it's kind of a strange expression. Speaking of multiple continents and multiple countries, add Singapore to the places where Basic Brewing Radio is heard. Keat from Singapore put a pushpin on our Frapper map. And thanks again to everybody who's taken the time to visit that map and make their presence known out there. And as I've said before, I don't get anything financially out of the Frapper map. It's just fun to know where you all are. Now on to our conversation with Tony Simmons. As I've mentioned in the past couple of episodes, the American Homebrewers Association is celebrating National Homebrew Day on Saturday, May 6th. Part of that celebration is what the AHA is calling the Big Brew. That's where homebrewers across the country and the world, around the world, are encouraged to get together and share the hobby of homebrewing with each other and with friends and family who don't brew yet. One of the recipes that the AHA is suggesting this year is Poor Richard's Ale, which Tony came up with. We had a chance to chat with the father of Poor Richard's Ale, Tony Simmons. Well, Tony Simmons, welcome to Basic Brewing Radio.
Well, thanks, James Spencer. I appreciate being invited to participate here.
Now, before we talk about your recipe, I want to talk about your new venture. On the recipe that I downloaded a while back, you're listed as being with Brick Oven Brewing, but I did a search for you on the web, and I found you at Pagosa Brewing Company in Pagosa Springs, Colorado. What's up with that?
Well, I live in Pagosa Springs, Colorado, and the original plan was to do a brew pub, a pizza brew pub, hence the Brick Oven name. But found that financially my restaurant partner ran out of cash before we even really got started. And when I was looking around for other potential investors, it was taking longer than I thought it should. And I just said, I'm going to bite the bullet and move forward with a microbrewery and tasting room, and that's what Pagosa Brewing is. It's our hometown mountain brewery.
And what kinds of beers are you going to serve there?
Well, I've been doing a lot of pilot batches over the last few years, and my Hefeweizen, Wolf Creek Wheat, is a big hit. My cream ales have been well received. I think right now the two biggest, most popular beers, I'd say, are my IPA, Powder Day IPA, and the Poor Richard's. Poor Richard's Colonial Ale has been a surprisingly, a surprising favorite here in Pagosa and around the country too, I think.
And you're going to have a giant beer garden and food from other local restaurants?
Exactly. We're going to have this beautiful private and large beer garden that's tree covered with these absolutely stunning views of the peaks. Because we're here at 7,000 feet, by the way, in the Rockies, and we have these 11 and 12,000 foot peaks that circle our town. It's a pretty nice place. And then I'll have basically the plan is to get the restaurants surrounding the property to basically supply the food. Some I can sell directly out of the tasting room, and others people can order pizzas or other food delivered. So I think it might sort of merge the two models of brew pub and microbrewery.
So you're another person that we've talked to on this show who's living the home brewer's dream. Or trying to get going. What are the main challenges that you've found in trying to set up a brewery?
Right, it's a good question. I mean, and we can say it's a home brewer's dream to go pro, but there's a lot of challenges. It's not just as simple as just brewing beer. It's really trying to figure out if you can make money doing this, because there's a lot of investment. Home brewing is terrific because you can do it bootstrap your way through it and end up with some terrific, great beer for you and your friends. But when you suddenly have to invest 50, 100, 150 more thousand in a system, plus a place, plus distribution and everything else, it starts becoming a lot more complicated and a lot more risk is involved. The key thing I would say to somebody who's interested in going into the brewing business is, go get some experience, and that includes, I would probably say, some brewing school, because you want to make sure you can dial everything in on a consistent basis. But you really got to have a comprehensive business plan. Now, I've been very fortunate. My background is in marketing and business, and that business plan made all the difference in the world in terms of, generating revenue or generating funds for the brewery. Fundraising is a key component. Getting a good banker on board, getting a good accountant on board, getting a good lawyer on board early on really helps you tremendously in trying to make this a reality.
Yeah, I would assume I've read most of Sam Calagione's book about Dogfish Head, and it's basically it's less a brewing book, more a marketing book, and it's a good book.
It's a great book. Sam's a great guy, and I actually just started that. He gave me a signed copy at the Craft Brewers Conference recently. Whether it's Sam's book and Steve Hindy has just done one for Brooklyn Brewing, which I'm also in the middle of. It's not so much the brewing. I mean, to be perfectly honest, that's relatively easy if you got some experience or a knack for it. It's raising the money and knowing how to run a business. That makes a big difference, because that's what you have to do no matter how good a beer you make.
That was my reason for bringing up Sam's book, was that he does make some awesome beers, but he also has a knack for building the brand. And if you don't get the brand out there, people aren't going to be trying your beers.
Exactly.
Well, speaking of trying your beers, how's that for a segue? I'm glad that we have this chance to talk. Your beer, your Poor Richard's Ale, is one of the recipes that's being suggested for the Big Brew, the American Homebrewers Association Big Brew, coming up on Saturday, May 6th. And you've got to be proud of that. But
very proud. Very, very honored, actually.
It was originally developed to celebrate Ben Franklin's birthday back in January, and I was going to interview you back then, but I got busy and I got distracted, and I put it off and missed my chance. So I thought, well, now if I interview you, I'll be off topic. So I'm so happy that they put your recipe in as one of these beers, because now I can be topical and talk to you about Poor Richard's Ale. But talk to us about, it was a contest to come up with a recipe to celebrate Ben Franklin's birthday, right?
Right. So the Brewers Association, the Professional Brewing Association, was looking for a commemorative recipe. And they gave us a little bit of heads up in the late summer and said that we're going to be doing this judging at the GABF. And you have to be a professional member of the association to participate. And basically they asked for your rationale and recipe in advance, and then you sort of moved on to the finals with an actual beer that had to be brewed and brought up to the GABF. And it was a pretty interesting experience. I did several pilot batches to try to dial in, my theory as to what, colonial beer was supposed to be. Because just to put it in perspective, there really was nothing written down until after the 1800s. So if you were trying to commemorate Ben Franklin's life and what he drank and how things happened in colonial America, documentation was very scarce. I had to use a lot of references to sort of paint this picture of what I thought, the typical brew might be in colonial America. Afterwards, things were well documented, and even before, the colonists were there, things were documented in Europe very, 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 very much in detail. But, it was really it was a lot of crafting to come up with this theory as to what a colonial beer would be.
And that's one thing that really impressed me, and I guess it impressed the judges as well, is the narrative that went along with the recipe, not just the recipe, but you broke it down as far as beer style, malt, adjuncts, mashing, and justification for each of the elements of the recipe. And it was really interesting to me how you did that, and how do you even get started? I mean, what sources do you, and you list your source on the third page of the recipe document, but I wouldn't even know where to start.
Well, that's a good question, actually, there, James. My first thing was to figure out a little bit more about Ben Franklin. So I started reading, his autobiography and finding out quotes of, what he did, and he was a big advocate of temperance. Making sure people didn't get too drunk because they drank beer constantly. I mean, the water, they didn't realize, microbiologically what was going on with the water, but people could get sick and even die drinking the water. But if you drank beer, it was nutritious and kept you alive. So they drank beer for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, some people, and you're like, well, what does that mean? How is beer defined? And I looked through a lot of reference books. It's a good thing I had a lot of great books, a whole beer library, if you will, and just really started going through them sequentially. I go to the index and say, is there anything about colonial or Ben Franklin or historical, and just try to glean certain tidbits of information to try to, weave this picture of what was going on back then. But the key component came when I realized that until the 1800s, when America started becoming more industrialized, basically everything was imported from England. And so when the Revolutionary War was going on, ingredients were very hard to come by. And then it made a lot of sense to see that they used local ingredients when they as adjuncts to try to extend their brewing, especially because they had to brew constantly to keep this population well coiffed, you might say. Molasses and corn were two very American ingredients, and it kept coming up more and more as I went through all of my reading, and that's how you sort of come up with a theory and then see if you can justify it by going through back some of these reference sources again.
So what is the style of Poor Richard's Ale?
Poor Richard's, and I think the representative of the style of the 1700s, they drank a lot of strong beers. But they weren't quite old ales. I didn't think they were quite as strong as that because they drank them on a regular basis. I mean, you couldn't drink old ale for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It would knock you flat. But, basically it was, a moderately strong, amber ale that had, corn, which lightened the body, made it very drinkable, and some molasses to offset some of those expensive hops that were coming from England. American hop production didn't really kick in until the 1800s. So in Ben Franklin's day, what are you going to do to give that beer that special taste? And there were a lot of spices they used, but really from a professional brewing standpoint, that didn't really get well documented until later on in Franklin's life. So I thought, molasses might be a nice spice. It has that sort of, spiciness, bitterness almost that is comparable to using hops. So that's how I sort of interpreted it, was a moderately strong, amber ale that's light enough to drink, but still finishes not too cloyingly sweet.
But you talk about molasses, and I guess that one could say that your recipe isn't as authentic as it could have been because you don't recommend blackstrap molasses. Correct.
This kind of goes back to the competition in a sense that, I was trying to craft a recipe that would be well accepted by, a large proportion of brewers across the country. And in the pilot batches I did, blackstrap really is a very strong flavor. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't use it. And I met actually the brewer from Haines, Alaska, who said, hey, I want it as authentic as possible, so on my version of Poor Richard's in Alaska, we put in the blackstrap. Didn't slow down people whatsoever. They loved it. So if your listeners are interested, I mean, it's certainly something to try, but I would definitely make sure to keep the molasses, at a small percentage of your total fermentable, extract there.
So what kinds of flavors do you get from the blackstrap as opposed to the lighter colors of molasses?
It's a a good question. The blackstrap, you get a lot of these spicy, burnt, caramely flavors. You get even more of that sort of leaf tobacco aroma that comes off of it. It's really interesting, and I think in my next pilot batch for this, I'll probably try to put in maybe a little less blackstrap and see if it maybe balances out. Now that people are more familiar, at least in my neighborhood, with what this beer is tasting like. But the dark molasses gives it a lot of character. Some people tried light molasses, and it's just a little thin, I think. So I thought the dark was a good compromise position.
Well, maybe you could have like Poor Richard's Light.
Actually, I did try a Poor Richard's Light. I tried it with a little lighter molasses and also with an American strain of yeast, and it's good. It's drinkable, but it's not quite the same. The first, the batch that I was fortunate enough to win with was really the best, and it's because I really stuck to what I theorized on the recipe, with all that rationale I came up with.
Now, what's it like? You mentioned someone in Alaska brewing your recipe and doing his take on it. What's it like brewing a recipe that's being brewed by other professional brewers across the country?
Oh, I feel so honored. I mean, I went to a lot of work because people like Sam Calgione was also working on a recipe, and I knew I was up against some stiff competition. So that's why I went to a lot of effort to put this thing together. But to have other brewers brewing my recipe is just it's such a high honor, including Anheuser-Busch, by the way. I mean, those guys even went and did a pilot batch of this to try to cash in on some of the great publicity that we achieved through this program. To me, and having anybody brew one of my recipes, whether it's a home brewer or a professional brewer, is a great honor. And I think actually we were talking at one of the member meetings that it actually might be a Guinness World Record that one recipe brewed by more people than anything else before.
Wow. And ironic that it's Guinness.
That's a good coincidence. But I did want to touch on one thing you had said earlier, though, about what's authentic. And when they did the judging on this beer, it was done very differently than all the other judging at the GABF. GABF is double blind. A beer is sent in, it's assigned a number. I as a judge, and I judge at the GABF, I'm given a number, and it's totally anonymous. For the Poor Richard's competition, I had to stand there in front of the senior judges like John Mallett and John Harris and Steve Brandt and defend my recipe rationale and research. And John Harris pointed out that probably in the old days it wasn't as clean as this. You have a really great clean beer, but they didn't have any wild flavors. Whether it's Brettanomyces or Lactobacillus or some of the more funky flavors you might have actually gotten back in those days. But they felt that it was a modern interpretation of what this style could be.
Well, you want to go along with the modern palate as well, because
exactly.
You don't want to go too overboard because people wouldn't want to drink it, and then that kind of defeats the purpose. Exactly,
and the goal was to try to create something that was different. It was a totally new style, a new character of flavors, but still very drinkable, and that's where I was really happy that people were able to embrace that and brew that around the country. I think it was more than 100 breweries I think they ended up with in the end.
Wow. How many did you get to taste?
I probably had about 6. But the great part was I was able to try 4 of them compared to each other directly, and that was quite fun.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I guess they didn't get bottled, most likely. Did any of them get bottled?
Oh, actually a friend in Vermont sent me a bottled version, but there weren't too many bottled versions. Most of them were draft, which goes along with the spirit of what it was. Colonial Era was a draft beer. I think if there had been more, a year's worth of pre-planning, maybe it might have been a more bottled version. But I think mostly it was draft, and I think it went over pretty well that way.
Let's go over the ingredients. Let's start with malt. What was your thinking on designing the grain bill, and what kind of ingredients did you wind up with?
Sure. The malt that we have now, we are very fortunate now. I've been very fortunate to go to brewing school, and part of the Siebel Brewing education is going through a whole malting program. And within the malt that we have now as home brewers and professional brewers is just top notch. It's really great, super high quality. The malt they had back in the 1700s was a little sketchy. They had what they called low malt, which was a pale malt, and they had high, darker malts. And it was, really when they went to the roasting process, the stuff that got overly roasted became the darker malts. They didn't pick a certain Lovabond color. They were just trying to get it just a little toasted. And direct fire heat made it very difficult to control that. But if you could take some pale malt, which I think works pretty well for low malt, and then combine it with a group of darker malts, and certainly crisp malting in England has amber malts, which I think would be very, very authentic, although it's pretty difficult to find for both home and professional brewers. I felt that the addition of things like biscuit, special roast, and a touch of black malt would really approximate that sort of amber high malt sort of flavor.
And then, just as a side note, getting a little toasted is one of my goals in life. So that fits right in.
Well, Poor Richard's is the perfect beer for you then.
Now, you in addition to the malts, and I don't think did you mention Maris Otter as the
oh, I'm sorry, yes,
as the base malt?
I thought the Maris Otter would be a terrific base malt because it has that much more malty depth of flavor that I thought would be much more traditional with these were all based on English style recipes. And if you were to make an old ale, a Maris Otter is a great one to start with. So I thought it would really work well as the base malt.
And you've also, as you said earlier, you've got adjuncts in there for historical purposes. What was your thinking on the adjuncts, and what did you use?
Sure. The molasses was the ubiquitous sweetener of the time. And putting in, George Washington has a recipe for a 100% molasses drink, and it's just crazy because it tastes absolutely horrid. But molasses was, I thought, a great way of bumping up your gravity a little bit and adding a little bit of spiciness to offset for that lower hopping rate. If hops were extremely expensive back then and hard to come by, molasses was a good sort of semi-substitute. But the real crowning achievement, I think, was my idea of using corn. Other finalists had used molasses. People had read about molasses in other recipes. But I really felt that corn was an important American ingredient, and Ben Franklin was a big proponent of American ingredients. All of our founding fathers were brewers, and it was to get people away from all the rum that they were getting from the colonies down in the Caribbean, all the French and Spanish colonies down there. They wanted American ingredients, and beer was a drink of temperance, and corn was a great American ingredient. And the people from the Historical Society said that's what made a huge difference for them in their voting of My Poor Richard's was the fact that I was the only one to use corn, which lightened up the body and made it incredibly drinkable.
And what kind of preparation do you have to go through to use corn? What kind of corn do you use?
Well, in historical times, they probably used cracked local maize. For modern interpretation, I recommended the pre-gelatinized corn flakes, which you can get at pretty much any home brewing shop and certainly from any of the big suppliers. The advantage is that it doesn't require any additional cooking. I mean, it's almost, because it's pre-gelatinized, it's basically pre-mashed for you. So you can throw it in the last few minutes of the mash if you need to, or you can mash throughout the whole time. But I specifically kept the ratio about 18 to 20%, which I felt would keep people from getting any kind of stuck mash. If you use too much corn, or if you use too much wheat, for instance, as another example, it can really gum up things. Wheat in particular because of the glutens. But corn is surprisingly light and immediately switches to sugar at that temperature.
I have heard of one guy brewing your recipe locally, and he apparently said that his mash got stuck. So is that a concern with this recipe, or what should people do if they are concerned?
If somebody's concerned, I would certainly just throw in some, a half pound or 3/4 pound of rice hulls. That would help lighten it a little bit. But if you've got a good crack on your malt, you should be able to have some good husk material that would allow you to lauter properly. I haven't heard of anybody else having a stuck mash, but it all depends on the system and the fluid dynamics, you might say. But if there's any concern that you think 20% is a little high for your system, I would suggest throwing in some rice hulls. It's a perfectly easy and inexpensive solution. In
mashing, you had an interesting way to determine the mash temperature.
I was using 18th century text to figure out how they did. I mean, you have to realize back in the 18th century that they didn't have thermometers. They didn't have fancy equipment. They didn't have certainly microscopes. They didn't know what was going on. They basically followed the principles that their mentor taught them. They were apprentices, and they said when the water looks like this, that's when you do it. Because, you can stick your finger in, but what does a finger mean from 150 to 160? It's just hot.
Yeah, and if it's boiling, you judge by the size of the blisters that come up when you stick your finger in.
Exactly. But, in this case, the quote was when you've boiled your water, which, we now know that if by boiling the water, you've gotten rid of all the microbes that might make you sick, and it's cooled enough, the steam is cleared, you can see your reflection in the water. Well, actually, when the steam clears and you can see your reflection, it kind of works out to be about 154 degrees, which is a terrific mash temperature. And in looking at other historical recipes from both Greg Noonan and Ray Daniels for Scottish ales and old ales, that was right on target. So that was how I moved along with that theory, too. You come up with theory and see if you can support it with some evidence.
Now, what does 154 do for your mash?
154 is a terrific temperature, I think, for a nice, full-bodied English ale. If you wanted to make something a little lighter, you can go down in a mash temperature. If you went down to 149 or so, you're going to get a lot thinner sort of beer, a lot more fermentables. Smaller sugar molecules are going to be created that ferment a little lighter. But there are so many styles of beer that if everything was at 149, it would get a little boring, I think. So I brought it up to the 154. You can certainly go up to as high as 159, but you're going to start getting a very chewy beer because, the way those maltose proteins or sugars, break down, they're going to be in longer chains, and the yeast can't, or the amylase can't break down into the very smallest of molecules. So basically, in a nutshell, you're going to have a chewier beer at a higher temperature and a lighter beer, mouthfeel-wise, at a lower temperature. But if you get beyond 160, you're gonna start denaturing, and below 140, you won't even be able to really convert all that starch to sugar.
Now, we've got listeners around the world, and I've been asked to make sure that I do metric equivalents when we're talking about these temperatures.
Uh-oh.
So the saccharification temperatures, the range that you're talking about is from 60 to 70 degrees Celsius.
Correct.
And then 154?
I would do 67, almost 68 degrees Celsius.
Okay, well, there you go.
67.5 to 68.
We kind of forget that we're, in an island in a metric sea.
Very true. And in professional brewing school, we did everything in Celsius. But, back here in Colorado, it all goes back to Fahrenheit again, and so I've sort of lost my conversion. But you can certainly do it pretty easily online. I happen to be at one that just does it when you pop in the number. But most of my thermometers actually in the brewery are both.
Now, hopping. You've got an interesting hopping schedule. What did you choose for hops, and why? And why did you choose the hopping schedule that you did?
I went, and here's another example of finding a resource. I found the history of Kent Golding hops online. It was you go through this massive tome of information, but basically, they were discovered in the 18th century, and were very popular. But before that, they added all kinds of wild spices and flavors and things to help preserve the beer. I mean, we all know the story of India Pale Ale IPA and the additional hopping rates and the additional alcohol allowed it to survive that journey. And I felt that back especially in England and the colonies, they were using Kent Goldings, but they weren't looking for that great hop aroma we do now in so many beers. They were looking for something to offset that malt sweetness, something to make it very drinkable and help on the stability a little bit. So basically, I was looking at Kent Goldings in pretty straightforward hopping rates, 60 minutes, 45 minutes, and 30 minutes. I didn't put in a lot of aroma hops, primarily because I felt if there was a hop shortage, you're going to use what you need for bittering, and you're going to use your molasses to give it that extra little spice, those aromatics at the end, because the molasses goes in probably the last 10 to 15 minutes of the boil.
Did you do some experimentation on different hop times and amounts?
We tried doing. In fact, I tried some pilot batches that had different hopping rates. But if you put in if you go more aggressive on your hops, you end up tasting more of the hops than tasting the malt and the molasses. And I really felt the malt and the molasses were the high points of this style. In Durango, we did a group brew, and we did add a little bit more hops to it, and it's a perfectly good beer. But like I said, it's a little bit more aggressive on the bittering. And if you from a home brewing perspective, if you like an aggressively hopped beer, go for it. If you're looking for something that's more true to what I interpret as the style, I would try to keep it pretty light. Really kind of what a strong Scotch ale would be. I'm looking at IBUs at 26, 27.
And you specify in the recipe whole hops. Is that just for historical purposes?
Primarily for historical purposes. I've been to pellet factories, and it's amazing, but it's certainly a modern device. I was really going historical in that respect, and my system works well with whole flower hops, so it worked both ways for me.
And lastly, one of, if not the most important ingredient in beer, because without it, we'd have soup instead of beer. The yeast.
Well, this kind of goes back to this goes back to the whole point that yeast is definitely the majority of your flavor in beer. People are unaware. People think it's the malt and the hops and the spicing and whatever, but really the yeast determines what style of beer you have. The only thing is that back in the 1700s they had no idea. This was all done with open fermenters. They weren't doing culturing. They didn't have microscopes. It was well before Pasteur had done his experiments. So what I assumed was that they had maybe had some yeast cakes or maybe did spontaneous fermentation, but there was actually no references whatsoever to whose yeast style. I don't think they even really knew it was yeast. There were house flavors. So a modern interpretation, I felt, or a modern equivalent, was to use probably what they were using before, which is an English or a Scottish style, which again ties back to that whole idea. It's an old ale. It's a light version of an old ale with this sort of lighter hopping of a Scottish ale. A moderately strong beer that you can certainly enjoy throughout the day.
And you bring up that they didn't know it was the yeast that made the beer. It makes you wonder how they started. Did they start with just clean crocks and just kind of accidentally stumble into good beer just like the old days, or did maybe did they bring their old crocks from over fermentation vessels from the old world, or is there anything to indicate what they did?
They certainly knew the steps it took. I mean, they've been brewing beer for something like 6,000 to 8,000 years, and in the last before microscopes, in the 500 years before microscopes, they got pretty good at it, just following the same process. So they knew what shapes worked better, they knew what materials worked better, but you had to bring brewers in. Brewers were at least on the professional, a lot of people homebrewed. I mean, everybody really homebrewed. But a brewer was somebody that you brought over from England, somebody you paid good money to set up your process. And the process was something he probably learned from his forebearers in England from the last generation. Did they know about yeast? It's kind of sketchy. I mean, they certainly knew how to make beer, but it probably wouldn't be considered good beer by our standards. There were probably a lot of flaws in it, a lot of wild flavors and contaminations. But it was something you didn't get sick off of, and you got a nice, pleasant, result from drinking a beer.
Could have been the inspiration for the the documents that founded the country.
Yeah, exactly. That's where people like they do in England today go to the pubs. They lived in very small homes, and they could socialize in the pubs, and they spent a lot of time there. And what's interesting about Franklin was that at first he was really anti-drinking and anti-pub, and then he realized that he could get more out of people and get more people supporting him if he went to the pubs. And so he would do this, and there was a lot of quotes about him lifting a lot of pints of ale while talking very philosophically about what we should do with this great nation of ours.
We are a nation founded on beer.
Well, you do know that there is theory out there that human civilization came about because of beer. Why would people move from nomadic society to agrarian society? There's got to be some reason to move to agrarian. Well, you can grow a lot of barley when you're suddenly become an agrarian society that isn't roaming around so much. You could do a lot better malting of your grains.
They found a good brew pub, so they settled down and
exactly. So maybe they'll be my next project would be to figure out something, another historical beer.
Well, great. I appreciate your taking time out. I know it's a busy time for you setting up your brewery, and I will put a link to your brewery's website in the description of this episode on basicbrewingradio.com.
Well, great. Well, thanks, James. It's been a real pleasure. I hope I didn't overstay my welcome, but I really have a great passion for this, and I encourage everybody to go out there for Big Brew Day. It's a week from Saturday, and it's great fun to get out there with your friends and a lot of newcomers and show them how brewing can be done pretty easily. here's a 250-year-old recipe, and it makes a pretty decent beer. And if you don't like that recipe, there's lots of other ones people can do too.
Excellent. Thanks, Tony.
Well, thanks. Nice talking to you.
Thanks again to Tony Simmons for joining us. And as I said in the interview, you can find a link to his Pagosa Brewing site on basicbrewingradio.com. Just look in the description of this episode. You can also see a picture of Tony with a mug of Poor Richard's Ale. Well, next week I hope to have an interview with Tess and Mark Samatulski, authors of Clone Brews and Beer Captured. I've asked Tess and Mark to help us make sense of all the many varieties of hops that are out there. Which ones are good to use in which beers and for what reason and when to use them and all that. So I hope to talk to them soon, and we'll have that on next week. If you have brewing questions, show suggestions, or just want to say hey, write to james@basicbrewing.com or just fill out the contact form on basicbrewing.com. And please don't forget to tell us where you're from. And, by the way, while you're on our site, you can check out our online shop where you can find pricing, good pricing on our DVDs, and a combo deal to save you even more. And also, as a note, we have T-shirts for sale now in sizes up to 6X. So if you're looking for a shirt up to 6 extra large with the handsome Basic Brewing logo on there, you can find it at our shop on basicbrewing.com. In our DVDs in Basic Brewing Introduction to Extract Home Brewing, we walk you through the extract brewing process step by step from boiling to bottling. And in Basic Brewing Stepping into All Grain, we take you through the all grain process from milling your grain to collecting your wort. You can see a listing of the fine folks across the country who sell our DVDs on basicbrewing.com. And if there isn't a vendor in your area, you can order it online. And if your local homebrew shop doesn't carry our DVDs, maybe you can suggest that they contact me to find out how. Until next week, thanks for listening. I'm James Spencer. Production help for Basic Brewing Radio and our website is provided by Kelly Dotson. Basic Brewing Radio is a production of Active Voicing. We'll talk to you next time. So long.